This is Fresh Tracks Weekly. This week we are following up on last week's discussion about how the Senate is trying to use the budget reconciliation process as a way to sell public lands and how a failed amendment shows us exactly who is for and against this idea. But before that, we have a few news stories from the week. The U.S. Supreme Court just ruled that the firings of the federal probationary employees can move forward, at least for now. There's been a lot of confusion as to the status of these employees initially being fired for about 40 days and then being rehired after the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals hearing last week. But now they're being sent back home, which just has to be super confusing and disheartening for these 16,000 employees, along with the other individuals that are close to the matter. But in this most recent development, the Supreme Court did not say whether or not the firings themselves were legal, but rather that the nonprofits that brought the case did not have legal standing to sue over the federal employees being fired. So this is very likely not over. The question over the legality of the firing still stands. While those particular nonprofits don't have legal standing to the case, it doesn't mean that someone else won't. In the meantime, it's unfortunate that these certain programs within these federal agencies that affect public lands, fish, and wildlife are struggling to complete critical work with these employees missing. Speaking of programs missing critical employees, a National Oceanic Atmospheric Administration employee was among those recently fired. The employee was responsible for making sure salmon hatcheries in the Puget Sound comply with regulations designed to minimize the impacts of the hatchery fish have on the wild endangered salmon. The role of Chinook salmon within the ecosystem, both freshwater and saltwater, along with the importance to the economy, is really hard to quantify. But suffice to say, it is very significant. Alteration to the salmon's habitat, primarily through the construction of dams, has led to sharp declines in the wild Chinook. To combat this, hatcheries try to help fill the cultural, ecological, and economic void that was created by these missing fish, but it's a really tricky endeavor while trying to maintain those wild stocks that are still hanging on. It requires having people who know what they're doing to ensure that the hatchery fish don't have too much of an adverse effect on the wild fish, which was the job of that person recently fired. But the part that is really troublesome for examples like this, when people who haven't been versed in the research look at it, they might say, well, let's just grow and release more salmon from the hatcheries. But this exact logic has been tried before and has been shown to be very counterproductive to keeping the wild salmon healthy. The moral of the story is when you don't have trained individuals who understand the biology, you can have very detrimental effects to the fishery. Not only are people being fired, but federal employees are leaving and retiring much earlier than planned because of frustrations with the DOJ efforts. Mike Koshmal of Wildfile recently interviewed Chris Servine about how the interagency grizzly bear study team is being disbanded and how it could affect grizzly bear management moving forward. The interagency grizzly bear team has been the key component of grizzly bear management within the lower 48 and is by far the main thing working to help grizzly bears be delisted from the endangered species list. Randy has worked with the team for years trying to develop plans that comply with the ESA, which could lead to the eventual state management of grizzlies rather than the current federal management. Whenever dealing with the ESA, it requires a significant amount of science and documentation to prove that grizzlies have recovered so it can stand up in court in the inevitable lawsuits to come. Servine has worked with and led the interagency grizzly bear team for years, but he retired in 2016, passing on leadership to a new group of biologists. But when another longtime wildlife biologist on the team retired, his role is not being refilled because of the hiring freeze. And then another team's leader retired because of all the fear and upheaval within the federal government. Now just a few biologists and technicians remain on the team and face a nearly impossible task ahead. The possibility of having successful management and delisting of grizzlies just got a lot harder. The Wyoming Game and Fish Department recently put out a release detailing their chronic wasting disease surveillance report for 2024, showing significant prevalence throughout the state. A total of 5,276 samples were tested, 13.7% of which came back positive for CWD. Further breaking it down by species and sex, 19.4% of mule deer bucks came back positive, 29.2% of whitetail bucks came back positive, and 2.3% of adult elk were positive. It is notable that the total numbers were similar to those of last year, both in terms of the number of samples tested along with the percentage of positive results. That being said, CWD was detected in multiple new areas this year, both within deer and elk, and this includes on 4 of the elk feed grounds. Now CWD has been found in 95% of the mule deer hunt areas and 62% of the elk hunt areas. The Lander region and the Cody region continue to have the highest prevalence of CWD in deer with 66% and 47% respectively. And the Iron Mountain elk herd has the highest prevalence of CWD in elk at 10%. There has long been a lot of theories about what will happen when CWD reaches the feed grounds, as elk are very concentrated through the winter months. Well, it's officially happening, so we're about to find out if any of those theories are correct. Before we get to some of the news detailing frustrations over everyone trying to sell public land, we have a positive story where 50,000 acres of public land is being opened up after a lengthy battle over access. In Colorado, a legal battle between Garfield County and the High Lonesome Ranch lasted 9 years, trying to decide if the public could use several roads to access a parcel of BLM over 50,000 acres. The legal battle began when the county asked the ranch to remove a lock on what was long considered to be a public road. The ranch argued that it was private, but after years of back and forth moving up in the courts, the road was deemed to be public because of Colorado's adverse use law, which says that roads that cross over private land that have been used for at least 20 consecutive years without landowner objection are considered public highways. The ranch now has to pay the county's trial costs, totaling almost $33,000, and they must remove any remaining obstructions from the sections of road. All right, now to some less exciting news if you're a public land advocate anyway. A conference held back in March called Homesteading 2.0, a proposal to make housing affordable again, discussed how they plan to use 850 square miles of Bureau of Land Management land to build new cities for affordable housing. They showcased several locations and where they could build these new cities, ranking them in order of preference. Most of the locations existed in southern Nevada outside of Las Vegas, with a few options up near Reno and Carson City. This talk is no longer about small parcels right next to Las Vegas. This is large chunks of BLM land, totaling 544,000 acres. They want to build, quote, freedom cities, basically new urban districts that cut through regulation. They want to waive or streamline NEPA reviews, fast-track permits, and offer strategic incentives to create hubs for American industry and innovation. So yeah, just take a bunch of your public land, subsidize it to make it super cheap for large companies to come in and develop it with minimal regulations and little regard to the impact it has on the environment. In other news, Mike Simpson, an Idaho representative, recently signed on to co-sponsor Ryan Zinke's Public Lands and Public Hands Act, which would prevent the sale or transfer of most BLM and Forest Service lands without congressional approval. This is an encouraging move coming from an Idaho representative, making a statement that he cares about public lands and recognizes that this is an important point to his constituents, the residents of Idaho. This also leads well into our deeper dive, where we are expanding on last week's discussion on the budget reconciliation and how they are trying to sneak in a provision about selling public lands. Well, last week we did this remotely because you were in Washington, D.C.
Yeah.
Maybe might have to get a little bit more about that. What else did you do while you were there?
I got to go to the Jefferson Library of Congress, went to the Natural History Museum, went to the Portrait Gallery, got a staffer tour of the Capitol, not like when you get in the big long line with 40 eighth graders.
Yeah.
That was pretty good. Kim really liked those parts.
That's cool.
So,
yeah,
it was interesting. And when I wrapped up on Friday afternoon, I bumped into one of the senators, and I'm like, "Aren't you guys supposed to be getting out of town today?" And he said, "Someone has told me we're going to be here till at least midnight tonight." And come to find out, they were.
Yeah.
They were way into the morning debating and arguing about budget reconciliation.
Right.
Which is part of what we talked about last week.
Yeah, I was going to say, we started talking about that, and then since then there was an amendment over the weekend, an attempt at an amendment,
right,
where they were basically voting on whether or not the amendment would have been to exclude public land from being used to
balance
the budget, I guess, essentially.
And that amendment was introduced by Senators Heinrich and Hickenlooper from New Mexico and Colorado, because they're big public land issues in their state. A lot of outdoor recreation, a lot of hunting, stuff like that. So when we did the one last week, we got a ton of comments from people, both in the YouTube video and just anecdotal comments. You know, when we cut little clips and put it on Instagram and stuff, it's like, whoa. So I'm thinking we need to continue to be two things. One, raise awareness about what's going on.
Yes.
But give people some understanding of how these processes work. Because if there's one thing I learned, yesterday I was out of town again in a big planning session on stuff related to this. I end up taking for granted that everybody's been doing this for 30 years. And so all of this jargon and our acronyms and process, they should just, well, this is what it means.
Right.
Well, in all that, in interaction with our audience, it's like, all right, Randy, not everybody has the benefit of this, years of doing it. So if we want people to be informed and to take action, we have to talk about this in kind of an educational sense. And we'll use some of the things going on right now as kind of a way to walk through how some of that works.
Yeah. Speaking of which, can you give us like a refresher on why this budget reconciliation, it only requires a simple majority for this to pass, which is why this would be an easier path to get the sale of public lands, I guess, into.
Yeah. The Senate has always been considered the deliberate debating house of Congress. Mm-hmm. It's just always been that way. There's 100 people. It's by every state has equal representation, whereas over here in the House of Representatives, there's a lot more of them. Mm-hmm. There's 435 of them, and it's all based pro rata on population. So in the Senate, it used to be as long as someone wanted to debate, you couldn't have a vote. So I think it was like Woodrow Wilson was president or something, or Taft or somebody was president at the time in 1917, 18, somewhere in there, where they said, we got to get some votes done. Mm-hmm. So the Senate said, we're going to adopt rules that say at least 2/3 of the members have to agree to stop debate, and we're going to go on a vote. So if 2/3 say, hey, shut up.
Right.
We've heard enough. It's been 3 days of listening to this. 2/3 of us want to have a vote. It would go to a vote. Well, I can't remember when it was. I think it was in the 70s. They dropped that down to 60 out of 100.
Yeah.
Because the Senate has 100 people in it. So there's really two processes of what you deal with in the Senate. First, you got to clear the hurdle at 60 votes to even have that's to like end debate. They call it cloture. Well, then once you say, all right, we're done debating, now we're going to vote, that only requires the 51 out of 100, unless it's a budget bill. So that's why they use reconciliation to get around the 60, because budget bills and all this reconciliation process only requires 51 votes.
Gotcha. Yeah.
So the people who over here on one side who say, boy, we'd never be able to get 60 votes on a bad idea or a controversial idea or whatever it is.
Yeah, exactly.
Let's attach it to a budget reconciliation bill. And then they only need 51. So that is the process that I was there talking about last week and was the big buzz on the Capitol, on Capitol Hill. Was the House passed its version of a budget, the Senate passes its version of a budget, they get together and do reconciliation. And they come out with something that they all agree on.
Right.
And if on this, you can get something attached at that point, it goes back to each of them. And if it passes a simple majority there, it goes to the president and gets signed. That's how we keep the government running. Like right now, we're on these what they call continuing resolutions. They argue and fight and threaten to shut down the government. Then they get together and they do all this. 10 o'clock at night, you hear, they came up with another, they call them CRs, continuing resolution. Mm-hmm. Goes to the president. He signs it at about 11:45 that night, and the government doesn't shut down. So they're trying to use this process, some people are, as the way to use public lands as one of the currencies.
Of course.
Yeah. And so there's some senators in the amendment you mentioned wanted to add to that this process cannot use public lands to balance the budget or, whatever purpose they want to use the sale of public lands for.
But the interesting thing about the fact that they introduced that amendment, and even though it didn't pass it, it gave us a glimpse into how what everyone's view is on this, right? And so we can go look and see who voted yay or nay, right, on this amendment. Yeah. And you can just go down and
see.
Yeah, what we thought would be interesting is looking at the states that have public lands, right? Because they have more of a vested interest. Generally, their population probably cares more about public lands, and see how each of those states, like what
did your senators
what
do?
did your senator do? Yeah, essentially. Because, Montana, both Steve Daines and Tim Sheehy voted for it.
Yeah, they broke ranks and came over and voted because of that bill was sponsored by two in the minority.
Right.
And a lot of times, especially in today's world, it's hard to get people to cross over.
For sure.
Well, in this instance, two senators, the two from Montana, said, "Yeah, we'd be happy with that amendment in here."
But then it ended up being 51-48 in that vote.
Yeah, because
right?
one senator was absent or something.
Yeah, somebody didn't vote, but
so it got defeated by 51. Yeah,
because it had the majority, right? Yeah.
So
but it's very close still.
Really close. So if you think about strategy, and if there's one thing we in the public land space sometimes lack, it's strategy. We make a lot of noise, we create a lot of awareness, but executing and coming up with strategy of how to do this and how to get what we want, you don't have to convince all 51 of those senators who these amendments, sometimes I call them virtue signals. They get to kind of vote to say, this is where I'm at on whatever issue. Sometimes the votes are already counted, and people know what the outcome's going to be.
Yeah.
But it allows, if they do it in the House or they do it in the Senate, it allows somebody to kind of virtue signal that, yeah, I'm on this side on that issue. And so on this one, you look at it and it's like, okay, it failed. If two more senators on the side that voted against it, or of the senators who voted against it, if you could just convince two of them to be regular public land supporters, all of a sudden you got the 51 to 49 in the favor of public lands. So I think in strategy, a lot of times we scream and yell and we get upset and we're all pretty wound up about this, but we don't think about, we think we got to convince, 50 senators or 45 senators or whatever. Really, in this case, for us to be having a winning caucus, if you want to call it that, winning group on public lands, we only got to bring two more senators over to the side of, hey, public lands, I got a lot of hunters in my state. I got a lot of public land in my state. They tell me they want two things. They want productive public lands and they want access to those public lands.
Yeah.
If we could do that.
Yeah. And then of the states that essentially the senators who voted against this, so essentially those are the ones that we need. The states that have public land, right? I mean, that's the low-hanging fruit. It's like you have public land, you have a vested interest. Generally, your residents might care more about that public land. So the states that have the highest amount of public land with senators who voted against this, those are the places where it would make most sense for them to come over onto that side.
Yeah.
Which we narrowed it down to essentially, 4 states?
Yeah, when we overlaid our audience of hunters,
of
what states have a lot of hunters, percentage-wise, and what states have a lot of public land, and say, okay, if you rank them by state, what are 4 that really stand out where their senators were on the other side? Mm-hmm. And so that's a total of 8 people.
Yeah, 8 total senators, two per state. So you have Alaska, Utah, Idaho, and Wyoming. Yeah. And those are the states that senators voted against this that have a lot of public land.
Right, and a lot of hunters.
All of those states have a lot of hunters, yes. Yeah. For sure.
Yeah. So strategically, if you were building a campaign, which I think we are, in what we talk about here in this office, we're just here to win. We don't care about all the other stuff. We're just here to win. How do we convince hunters and public land advocates in those 4 states to speak up, to move this up their priority list, even though they probably voted for these people, and that's fine. But it's the public pressure that will bring this to a higher priority.
Yeah.
And It's proven that on not just this issue, but other issues, if there's enough pressure or enough comments, enough interest on an issue in that state, that person will break ranks.
Right. Well, that's what happened in Montana, right?
Right.
Like that. I mean, like essentially, that's why there's enough people fired up in Montana about it that
Right. Those two senators are like, look, I am here to represent my people.
Yeah.
And my people have told me, just don't go there. And I mean, we're lucky in Montana. We got great access to our senators. But if you look at these 4 states you mentioned, Wyoming has fewer people than Montana.
Yeah.
Idaho has a few more. Alaska has about what Montana does. Utah has a lot more than Montana. But they both have a lot of hunters. And they both have a lot of public land. Or they all have a lot of public land. So...
But yeah, in all 4, but even especially, I guess if you exclude Utah a little bit, like you said, there's a lot of people in Utah, but like just essentially, if you look at the per capita, availability to your senator, then
Right.
your voice has, it's a louder impact essentially, like in some place like Wyoming, Idaho, it's like, you have a pretty big voice, like in the scheme of things, like
you do, and that's, I think people sometimes discount that, because they see Congress and they see the 435 in the House of Representatives, where, well, my person's only one of 435. Well, if you're in Wyoming or Montana, Alaska, some low population state, you're, like you said, per capita, people are blown away how available senators are from those states. If you talk to someone from California or Florida or Illinois or New York or some state with a ton of people, they'd be like, you've seen your senator before? Well, yeah, he walks up and down Main Street of Bozeman whenever he's back in town. So the same thing happens in these other states that we mentioned, and this is where I think we make some mistakes. We think that our job is to get people to vote for different folks. People are going to vote their priority.
Yeah.
Right. On a whole bunch of things, not just public lands, not just hunting or conservation. So if people voted for these people, the senators of these 4 states, they did it because that's where their values are on some priority. They have a different priority than I do. But that doesn't mean when these people vote against one of your other high priorities, hunting and public land, that you can't reach out.
Yeah.
And if the odds are, if you did vote for them, or you supported them, or you put a sign in their yard, when you do contact them, you carry way more weight than the person who maybe voted against them or is out screaming and yelling against them.
Yeah. No, and that's the thing. I mean, with some of these public land issues, like you said, like I could be wrong, but I feel like they are an important issue to a lot of, hunters, right? A lot of the people who probably are listening to this right now, a lot of hunters care deeply about public lands. Yeah. And a lot of the people of these smaller states or western states that have these high amounts of public lands, if they were able to vote on these issues themselves, it'd probably look very different. But like you said, it's like when you vote on a single candidate, you're voting on a lot of issues. You're not voting on just one. But if enough people are loud enough, they're in theory, they're there to represent the people, right? They're there to represent the state. So if enough people are loud enough about a particular issue, you can definitely sway it.
Yeah. I mean, just picking of these 4 states, Wyoming has the lowest population of any of them.
Yep.
And I'm not saying this to pick on Senators Barrasso and Loomis, but just the amount of comments and emails or phone calls that they would get to move this on their radar screen is way lower than it would be in California or Texas or Florida, states with a ton of people.
Right.
And so I think part of what we're trying to do in our process of, one, making people aware of the issues, but if you use a traditional marketing funnel that they teach in business school, the top of the funnel, the widest part of the funnel, you got to make people aware of your product or service. Well, in this case, we got to make them aware of the issue. You get down in the funnel, it's like, okay, we got to get them to consider this. All right. And then we need them to take action, which is way down in the funnel, that ends in a result. that's kind of what we're doing. We're always about awareness and education, so they'll consider the idea and they'll take action to do whatever.
Mm-hmm.
And if people get bored with that, I understand. I wish I could say I don't do politics and just zone it out. But if all of us said, no, I don't do politics, these public lands have no voice. They have nobody there speaking for them. And they will be looked at as, well, let's pay for some tax cuts by selling those public lands. Let's supposedly lower the cost of housing by selling some public land.
Yeah.
Well, the local schools, the school system isn't doing good in that state. Well, let's not raise property taxes. Let's sell some public land. So,
yeah, that's the hard part. I mean, as hunters, I feel like a lot of the reasons that we are hunters are to, be away from people, be away from it all, go out in the woods. And it's just like, I think it's hard to get involved when you just like, it's like you don't want to, right? It's just like,
you want to do something else.
Yeah. And that's the hard part. And
yeah. So
it's hard to, and then it's also hard to like try to convince people to, like, you need to care about these lands, but I also don't want more people on my public lands, So that, right. I mean, that's like been a big thing over the past few years too, of people worried about overpressure. But then it's just like at the same time, it's just like, if people don't care about them, then they'll sell them or they'll dispose of them in some fashion.
Something will happen.
So it's definitely a predicament that we're in.
Yeah. And so I hope people realize part of the message and the goal of what you and I talked about in doing this video is how do we get people to feel, let's get rid of that futility kind of why am I wasting my time feeling, and show people that there's a path forward. There's ways to do this. And you don't have to change your own priorities. Vote your priorities. And I don't care who it is you vote for. But when your priority issues show up on the radar, like in the budget reconciliation process, speak up.
Yeah.
Because looking at what we have ahead of us, the short-term thing between now and the end of May is this whole budget reconciliation process. And you're going to hear more of this. The reason it's on our platform so much is because that's the big, loud issue right now.
Yeah.
I wish we could be talking about, reintroducing wild sheep in some range. But right now, this is the issue.
Yeah.
So in the short term, between now and the end of May, I think is when their goal is to have the budget reconciliation process done. I don't know if they will, but these tricks and stunts they come up with to try lower the deficit, balance the budget, whatever you want to call it, pay for tax cuts. They're looking at public lands for that. Yeah. And we can't let that happen, because if that starts being the case, every time there's a tax cut, because they say we got to offset it with other revenues, are we going to sell public lands every time we have a tax cut? If we need more defense spending, are we going to fund that with public lands? So if we lose that in the short term, it really gets an ugly snowball rolling down the hill. So that's a short-term thing. Longer-term thing of why we continue to talk about this, and hopefully won't have to talk about it so much, is there's two other things that are coming down the pike. Is they want to sell. There's big plans out there in discussions, and they're floating the balloons around. Sell public lands for two other purposes: lower the cost of housing, which I'm afraid we're going to have to do another video on that. Because when was it, 2-3 weeks ago, we did the one about Southern Nevada? Yeah,
and the auctions that they've done on BLM lands in essentially Las Vegas. But
and what you found out is most of those homes sell for $1 to $4 million.
Oh, yeah. They're not what I would call affordable housing on most of those plots of land that used to be BLM.
And so now when we dig further, we find out that less than 100 of the 17,000 acres auctioned off went for affordable housing.
Yeah, that was an interesting article there. Yeah,
we're going to have to probably dig into that more. So that's one of the longer term issues. By longer term, I say in the next 2 years probably. And then the other is with Doge and everything, they're trying. Some of the real fiscal conservatives have said, you got to go find enough offsets in the spending cuts to balance what we want to do for tax cuts.
Right.
They're struggling to come anywhere close on the Doge efficiency savings to offset what the revenue losses are going to be on tax cuts. So they are looking for public lands. There's already been some senators who've said, hey, we got some lists. We know some acreage. We're not going to sell all the public land today, but if we could sell 500,000 acres or so, that adds to the offset.
Which is so frustrating because land is a finite resource.
Right.
It's not like it just renews. Like we can't just create more land. So it's just
Right.
It's short-sighted.
Yeah.
I think that's the most frustrating part about all of this is we know that
Right.
once it's gone, it's gone. It's permanent. This is not something that we get back.
And if Congress doesn't change their ways about how they budget, how they spend, how they bring in revenues, it's kind of like the drug addict or the alcoholic, right? If you don't get them to change their addiction and you just keep giving them money, pretty soon you're out of money.
Yeah.
It's maybe that's not the right comparison, but so those are two long-term issues that people are going to hear from us about. And they're very relevant. When I came back I came back on Sunday, actually. We did the tourist thing. Got caught up in a big parade and stuff that I didn't even know was going on. That should be a shop story, that one. But with all this, coming back, I was processing the week of being there and talked to some other people over the weekend, and they're like, yeah, this is for real, Randy. This is no longer just idea and theory and ideology. There's a lot of energy behind using the public lands for all kinds of different things, because a lot of these people don't use public lands. They're far from them. They just think of Yellowstone Park. Yeah, that's what their version of public land is. So when you'll often hear a politician say, "Oh, we aren't going to touch the national parks."
Right. That's not what we're worried about as hunters. Like,
right.
Great, national parks fine, but not what we're worried about.
Yeah. And why do they say that? Because they know overall in America, almost 90% of people it would be a big revolt if they sold the national park.
Yeah.
So but they understand that most Americans, that's their idea of public lands.
Yeah.
So our job is to get Americans connected to understand, these public lands are used for resources, for recreation, for tourism, for all kinds of different things.
Yeah.
And so we got a lot of work ahead of us, but I hope that this process gives people some ideas. We can put a link in there where they can get a hold of whether it's their senator or one of these, a senator in one of these states. But when you do it, and please do it, I call it the 3 Ps. Be polite, be professional, and be persistent. Because if you go off the rails and you're just so emotional about it,
let's tune it out. They're not going to listen to it. Yeah.
So that's, I guess that's our ask of this, right?
For sure.
Go find your senator. Let them know you don't want public lands to be any part of budget reconciliation or offsetting tax cuts or balancing budgets. Manage those lands better, and let's keep working on access to those lands. Well, pretty simple.
That was a great call to action. Great note to end on.
All right. Thanks, Marcus.
Thanks, Randy.